Welcome everyone, and thank you for taking time to join this interesting webinar topic today. And our resource person, well, I met him in one of the OECM workshop here in the Philippines, and he gave a very good presentation about OECM. And during that time, we were also doing webinar on ICCA mapping. And after that call, everybody, I did a poll on the next topic that they wanted to hear from through this webinar that we are doing every 2 months. So OECM came as the one of the choices by many. And fortunately, Harry was there, so I talked to him and he agreed. So I think Harry is not new to many of us here, but anyway, just a brief introduction. He is also an honorary member of ICCA, and now he is currently the co-chair of IUCN OECM Task Force Works. So welcome, Harry.
Hi, everybody. This is me, Harry. Thank you so much to all of you for being on the call and Amy for setting it up. This is a real opportunity for areas outside of protected areas to be better recognized in some. And the second thing is that this is an idea which really originated within the consortium to promote this strange phrase, other effective area-based conservation measures, also known as OECMs, in a way that was more inclusive of areas that are not going to be or want to be formal protected areas, but are contributing to the conservation of nature in their own diverse and wonderful ways. Okay, so that's really, I just wanted to square that away. So where has this come from? The CVD's 10th Conference of the Parties held in Nagoya, Japan. That's where we agreed the last strategic plan, the strategic plan 2011 to 2020, finishing this year. And those 20 targets that it contained, there is target 11 on area-based conservation measures. Now, I've just highlighted protected areas in this slide because often I used to hear people talk about this target as the protected areas target. And that is definitely, well, as far as I'm concerned, led to stimulating countries to increase their protected areas coverage. Some people would say for better or for worse, that's a longer discussion. But here, globally right now, we're just about over 15% of terrestrial protected areas, and 8% of global oceans are covered in protected areas, which is good news for conservation. But interestingly, Target 11 also contained this phrase, other effective area-based conservation measures. It was basically saying countries, as in the parties, could reach these targets through protected areas and or other effective area-based conservation measures. But soon after, but basically, but already by 2012, 2013, there was no internationally agreed definition of OECMs. And as a result, people weren't reporting them or understanding what they were or what they could be. And that's about the time we wrote the first paper saying, this is a real opportunity, particularly if done well for ICCAs. Can we not set up a task force to look at it, which is exactly what happened. So here we have, this slide begins top left and works its way around to top right. What I really, the takeaway here is not the details, but it's just to show you that in blue, it's IUCN's work, and in orange are CBD meetings that we attended, presented back to, and continued. And so you can see in sum, there's work done by the task force. We presented at the CBD. We'd then go back and have workshops and write shops and thinking about things and producing drafts, and we went from there. There's 120 people in the task force, some members of the ICCA Consortium and other Indigenous or representatives of Indigenous peoples and local communities. And so that was a really thorough process. And the all-important meeting, the CBD meeting there, is in yellow. and that is CBD's 14th Conference of the Parties that occurred in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt in late 2018. And that is where parties and observers agreed a definition. So, and welcome to the call, Casey. So what you've read, this is the internationally agreed definition of what is an OECM. So it makes some sense. Always, whenever we talk about this, the first question seems to me and others is, well, if this is the definition of an OECM, how is this different from a protected area? Because it looks pretty similar. And so here's the crux of it. And this is a really simple but important concept. A protected area should be dedicated to conservation. And it should be an area where the main management is for conservation. Okay. And the simple contrast is that an OECM must deliver the effective conservation of biodiversity. It doesn't matter if it's dedicated to that end or not. And as you'll see later on, I think, others think, particularly with regard to ICCAs, that's really important. And it really frees up the ability to recognize areas essentially that are not dedicated to conservation, but are leading to the conservation of nature. And that's really, really important. Okay, what I'm going to show you here is a little diagram to show you how, when you apply this definition in landscapes and seascapes, the different kinds of areas you get. So what you've got here, first of all, across the top, is all of these areas deliver biodiversity conservation. Okay, in the first test, it's not a spectrum of low conservation to high conservation. It's all these areas are delivering the conservation of biodiversity. The difference, the spectrum, is how dedicated they are to conserving biodiversity, from zero dedication actually to full dedication to that end. And I'll show you how this works. So at the bottom end of the spectrum, these are areas where there's no focus on conserving biodiversity, but the areas are delivering biodiversity conservation. So how are they doing that? It's basically areas that are no disturbance, no-go areas. So particularly for ICCAs, we'd be talking about sacred sites and other areas that are just generally closed or absolute minimal disturbance in those areas. Yeah, so we call that ancillary conservation, something which is occurring almost despite what it's been set up to do. Okay. The next group of areas are areas that are conserved through very low impact use. And this is really where I think most ICCAs and LMMAs that are delivering conservation outcomes would sit. We've got watershed protection areas, non-timber forest product collection areas, medicinal plants within that, ecosystem service related wetlands, fishing areas, this kind of thing, that are being used in such ways that they're genuinely promoting the conservation of biodiversity. And interestingly, there are also some areas that are actually dedicated to conservation. I know that sounds a bit weird because we said they don't have to be, but this really was developed around ICCAs and LMMAs because there was a recognition that some areas may be, governed equitably, delivering conservation, and they will either never be recognized by national governments as protected areas, or they wouldn't want to be recognized as protected areas. And in those cases, it was felt by task force members based on arguments put forward particularly by Indigenous peoples and local communities in the fora, that there should be this slight caveat for areas that they are actually dedicated to conservation, but they're not being recognized, or they don't want to be recognized. So I hope that in that one image shows you that there are areas that are, all of these areas are promoting conservation through different means. And what I've done on this diagram as well is then shown you where protected areas sit. So protected areas would sit at the highest level of intention, where there's a primary conservation objective, and the area is also recognized as a PA. So what are we talking about here? OECMs can provide recognition, support, and security. Get into that in a minute. So this really diverse number of areas, and through that promote and support conservation outcomes and good governance, all occurring in areas outside of protected areas. And importantly, whilst we collectively here are very interested, obviously, in territories and areas governed by Indigenous peoples and local communities, OECMs can also be governed by government agencies. Military areas is an interesting category that has come up because not a lot of people are going in there. And some of them are very large and actually house a lot of, or provide habitat to a lot of different kinds of biodiversity. And of course, private entities, individuals, companies and others also can govern OECMs. And of course, you've got the final category, which is shared amongst one, or as in two or more of those, of the three core governance types. Now, I put this up at every meeting I go to, and I really underscore this point. This will be an obvious one for all of us on the call, but not so obvious for other people to whom I speak. And that's basically saying, what's interesting in the words we use, we designate protected areas because there is an area, most often it's a government decides this is going to be a protected area, and then they designate that area. OECMs are different, because OECMs are a recognition that there is a group, Indigenous, local community, or government or private, that is already doing something which is leading to the conservation of nature. And therefore, to recognize that appropriately means engaging in a very respectful way with the governance authority. I hope we can talk a lot more about that later on in the call, but that's a really important point. And in coming back to that first paper that we wrote that kicked off a lot of this work, we were basically saying, because of this fact, could OECMs be a really interesting antidote to these top-down designated protected areas, some of whom also overlap the lands of Indigenous peoples and local communities, creating a whole host of injustices. Could this be a different way of doing conservation, basically? So that slide there and what it talks to is really, really important for our group, and we can get back to that later on. Okay, so right here, I want to just update you to say everything I've just presented so far in the slimmest possible version is contained in a document on the left-hand side. This is just out at the end of last year, recognizing and reporting OECMs. It was the main publication that the task force produced, and it's intended to be an easily accessible way of understanding more about OECMs and the history and the CBD decision and this kind of thing on the left. And on the right-hand side, this is a work in progress, but the idea is that one could use this step-by-step methodology to identify, recognize, support, and report OECMs. It's intended to be used by custodians of areas, by Indigenous peoples and local communities themselves, as well as people working hand in hand with them. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is move into look at the kind of global opportunities that OECMs provide, a little generic, a little high level, but this is kind of where we are globally. And then the next set of slides will get into what it looks like, as far as I'm concerned, for ICCAs, LMMAs, territories of life. And then we can have get into the discussion. So at the higher end, what I've done here is I've basically taken target 11 and just said, OECMs can help deliver what we call the qualitative elements of target 11. Obviously it can contribute to the percentage targets, that's important at that level, but really it can help support these other more qualitative aspects. So areas of particular importance for biodiversity and ecosystem services, many of whom actually exist, A, outside of protected areas, and B, on the lands and in the waters are governed by Indigenous peoples and local communities. It can promote effective and equitable governance and management. That should have been, they missed out governance in target 11. Representative areas, we can help connect systems, both PAs helping connect OECMs and vice versa, not just one way, and integrating those into wider landscapes and seascapes, and seeing, again, moving towards that kind of connected vision as opposed to, you can do it, that connected vision as opposed to just thinking about blocks of PAs in one or other landscape, okay, or seascape. Great. So that's at a global level. Now we're moving into opportunities and challenges as for ICCAs. And this was very much this thinking drawn from the work that a few ICCA colleagues, including Emma Lee, who's on the call, who introduced herself at the top of the call, thought out basically in 2017. And, you know, this is going to be an ongoing conversation for us. Okay. Okay. So my point here is that, you know, ICCAs were actually referenced in CBD decisions, and that's a great thing. This is now recognition of these areas at a higher level, if we can say that. Globally, CBD said this is a thing we need to, parties are going to focus on this, and it is also referenced in the draft, at least, of the new strategic plan. So OECMs most likely are going to be an increasingly major part of global conservation. Here I'll list that as an opportunity. Later on, we'll talk about that as a challenge. This also means that a whole new range of actors will be engaged by people doing and wanting to do conservation. It's providing this official recognition, validation of the governance authorities who are leading to these conservation outcomes and their management regimes. It's the kind of a feedback to say, well, if the world is actually saying this is important, conservation outcomes, then IP and local community rights are important, and vice versa. So it's sort of strengthening those linkages. And an opportunity here is that it could lead to enhance security of these areas and the people living and working on those areas. It might lead to more appropriate support, but there are caveats there we'll get to later. It's quite possible that, as in, it's highly likely we're going to need to develop in time new policies, laws, institutional arrangements around OECMs, and that could be a very strategic moment to intervene and develop laws that really support in a very true way the governance authorities of these areas. And one of the points we made in this paper, also drawing on experiences coming out of, to some extent, Australia, to some extent Canada, that some of these processes may lead to what we were thinking, what is called in some other places reconciliation, and we were sort of thinking about it in a conservation context as restorative conservation, where relationships that have been severely damaged by historical and ongoing injustices can be restored. Reconciliation can be found between those kind of partners and a better future forged. But friends, as I'm sure all of you on the call are well aware, none of these opportunities and others that we might want to discuss later on are guaranteed at all. And actually there are some real challenges ahead for us. Okay. So now that OECMs are such a central part of the future, well, let's just put it this way, the ongoing global biodiversity framework but there is going to be an increasing amount of attention on a range of OECMs, including ICCAs, territories of life. The question is that all going to be beneficial? Might it generate more appropriate recognition, or could there be some negative consequences? A whole range of negative consequences, including, you know, large-scale programs set up by large organizations that take funds from the local level, from ICCAs, or pull them into sort of inequitable relationships. We've seen that happen. Might these, the legal frameworks that I was mentioning just before, might these actually lead to entrenching regressive approaches to ICCA, something that Emma Lee in our paper really underscored. And this point as well came from those conversations, also being underscored by Emma. You know, will this focus on OECMs as a quote unquote conservation designation, which it is in the first instance, lead to this kind of overemphasis on the ecological aspects of ICCA's territories of life, overshadowing, usurping, maybe even further damaging the social, cultural, spiritual elements of those territories and areas? And so that leads to this sort of larger question of how do we ensure OECMs, particularly when they're ICCAs, but I'd say across the board, are recognized with the free, prior, and informed consent of the legitimate authorities? And how can we ensure that, again, some of the mistakes that were made with protected areas, some places continue to be made with protected areas, are not brought across like a cut and paste? Oh, well, we know how to do protected areas. OECMs are kind of the same thing. We'll carry on as a business as usual, as opposed to reforming, revising, reimagining those approaches and relationships. Okay. So here I've just sketched out, again, drawing on the ideas that we set out. You know, how can we turn those opportunities into positive change? And this is a message for all of you. And then hopefully we can further thrash this out and make these messages for our broader community and communities. So one of the first things I think is actually becoming knowledgeable about OECMs, you know, the general frameworks, some of the core issues that we've discussed now, and engaging actively and critically within the framework's evolution. The point I want to underscore to all of you is that OECMs, first of all, as I said at the top of the call, hasn't come out of nowhere. Many of us collectively have been involved in these discussions, developing what is an OECM today, what we now understand that is an OECM. And that is going to continue. That's going to continue developing best practice at the in local to international levels. The more actively we engage, the more we know, the more we promote, the more likely our collective views are going to become the views, as opposed to other people defining what a framework, an OECM framework, should look like. So I hope that's a sort of an exciting invitation that there's a lot to play for, and essentially the more of us that get involved actively, the more likely we are to continue to bend the curve. You can do that by joining the task force if you really want to, and you just get in touch with me if you'd like to do that, or learning, thinking, providing feedback on the issues at that international quote unquote level, also engaging with it at these sub-national and national levels, and participating effectively and promoting what it should look like in your countries or in your you know, at the more local levels. Melissa Payne, who just joined the call, is doing that here in Malaysia. It's fantastic to see that going ahead. And many of you have been doing that through your own work, whether you've been calling them potential OECMs or not. And our challenge is to then use all that experience and make sure that OECMs embodies those ideas and those values. Something that I hope happens, and that is developing focused guidance on ICCAs and OECMs. That is an ongoing conversation within between a few people within the ICCA Consortium at the moment. And beginning in your own territories or with the Indigenous peoples and local communities with whom you're working, to recognize and report. And actually, that's what I've written there. I think more what I meant was thinking through locally how OECMs may or may not support those areas. That's really what I meant by that bullet point. I was just jotting this stuff today. I'm not saying you should go out and recognize OECMs. I'm suggesting using the framework, thinking about it locally, seeing critically where it's going to support, where it might undermine, and then reflecting on that and then promoting those ideas amongst ourselves internationally and nationally, as I've said. And so therefore, as a sort of the start to a plan of action that we could maybe all rally around is collectively, I'd welcome everybody in this call to get involved in this piece of work we want to do, which is developing some bespoke guidance on ICCAs, territories of life, and OECMs. Those of you who are involved at that level, involving yourself with the CBD processes or feeding your ideas to people who are involved at that level into this big or this major international meeting, which is going to happen in Kunming in October of this year, CBD COP15, and of course, as we then go through the next decade. Participating actively at the sub and national levels to ensure, for example, the support of new laws and institutional arrangements are established, and the practices are also developed in such a way that they're respectful of ICCAs. Make absolute sure that free, prior, and informed consent is central to any OECM framework, institutional arrangement, and continue to collectively develop good practice and promote that good practice amongst ourselves. Thank you so much for listening to all of you. And let's see this ensuing conversation now as exactly that. We're not talking about someone else's framework here. We're talking about our framework. We're talking about a very, very new concept that we can continue to shape as we see appropriate. So thank you very much, Amy, once again for the opportunity. And back to you. Thanks.